My name is Utanshi, and my pronouns are she and her. We're all here together as part of the OFC 16 Days campaign for the year 2020, which we are hosting as part of the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence campaign. We're very excited to be here. I'm accompanied with members from my team, where we're going to be talking about gender-based violence and how the conversation around gender-based violence ties into workplaces. We want to talk about how the conversation of gender-based violence is often seen in the binary of that which takes place within the workplace, and then that which takes place outside of the workplace. We will be talking about how that binary may not really exist, and how it's important for workplaces to go beyond that binary and recognize gender-based violence even outside of workplaces. To that effect, we'll try to see if there are any legal frameworks which govern the responsibilities that employees can have towards survivors of gender-based violence, and then end the conversation with some simple actionable interventions that all of us can undertake at our own individual workplaces in support for survivors. Before we begin, I want to do a quick round of introductions with everybody here on the team. Ashita, why don't you start?
Hi, I'm Ashita and my pronouns are she and her.
Hi, I'm Shruti and my pronouns are she and her.
Hi, I'm Vandita and my pronouns are she and her.
Hi, I'm Sanaya. My pronouns are she and her, and we're really glad to be having this important conversation with you today.
Thank you, everybody. I'm really excited to be speaking with you all and take this conversation forward. Before we start, however, I want to set some context to what we're going to be speaking about. And I want to ask you, Sanaya, what do you think is OFC's understanding of gender-based violence? And how would you say gender-based violence looks like?
So I'd like to start off by saying that gender-based violence isn't defined properly. There isn't a set definition. There are several of them that bodies and statutes use. For One Future Collective, we define gender based violence as violence that occurs against any person because of their gender. And this is not restricted only to women and girls, and also violence that affects persons of a particular gender disproportionately. And that violence could be in several forms. It could be physical violence, it could be mental, it could be sexual violence, and it could also include economic violence. And we'll be talking more about this through the course of this conversation. Shruti, would you like to add something here?
Yeah, I think Sanaya's covered this pretty well. But I'd just like to add one aspect to this conversation, and that is microaggressions. And it's something that we speak about at OFC often as well. So they take these forms of subtle behaviors and comments that really tend to invalidate a person's identity. And it perpetuates a lot of stereotypical and domineering narratives at the workplace. And it could be anything from direct everyday verbal slights or just occasional non-verbal snubs, but often they're packaged in such a way that it's not intended to cause harm, but their impact is of course different, and over time it can be very disturbing and isolating. And it's often dismissed by workplaces and not considered to be a real form of gender-based violence and not taken very seriously by organizations. But interestingly, one of the studies that looks at microaggressions reveals that when workplaces don't address these forms of behaviors, then there is a disconnect between existing workplace policies that focus on gender-based violence and the actual ability and willingness of the organization to enforce these policies. So I think it would be great to also speak about different nuances and what really constitutes as gender-based violence at the workplace.
Thanks, Shruti. Before we move ahead, I also want to add that an aspect of gender based violence that is important is the curtailing of power and liberty. And we will notice this in every type of gender based violence that we look at. So, whether it's physical or sexual violence with the absence of consent, and even through economic forms of violence where a source of income is cut off from a person because of their gender identities. So, uh, power and curtailing of liberty does form an important part of gender based violence.
Thanks, Anaya and Shruti, for really contextualizing the conversation and giving us an understanding of what gender-based violence can really look like, and how it's so much more than violence against women and girls, how it's also so much more than just physical violence or sexual violence, which is often what it's understood to be, which is often what a lot of us tend to think and speak about when we start talking about gender-based violence. Today, we'll also be speaking about how workplaces can really support survivors of gender based violence, not just against violence which they may face within workplaces, but also violence that they may face outside of workplaces. And why we want to have this conversation is also to understand that gender based violence is not an experience that we can classify by where it takes place, or solely by who is the person who's causing that violence to take place. So Vandita, I want to ask you, how and why should workplaces even look at supporting survivors of gender-based violence when instances of this violence have taken place outside of workplace? What is the need for workplaces to support survivors who face such violence?
Thank you for that question, Natanshi. As you mentioned, gender-based violence is generally categorized as, for workplaces at least, as violence that happens within the workplace boundaries, physical or the way they've defined those boundaries to be. And other is gender-based violence that happens outside of it, which could be street violence, which could be other forms of sexual violence. It could also just be domestic violence. For me, the most basic reason why workplaces should be responsible towards addressing issues of gender-based violence, irrespective of where they occur, especially when they happen with their own employees, is because these boundaries between a workplace and home are often very artificially created boundaries. They're the same. Second. Thank you. They're the same people that are often perpetrators outside that are working in different workspaces. We have a responsibility, one internally, to ensure that our workplaces are safe and secure for persons of all genders to not just work in, but for them to thrive in and to be able to achieve their maximum possible potential. And outside of the workplace, I would say that, of course, there's a massive argument for how the productivity of the person may get affected, the after effects of trauma on the survivor, but also just because workplaces are massive. There are companies in the world that have a combined value that is more than that of the GDP of different countries. When companies and when private entities start becoming this large, what about rights and responsibilities that they have to extend to their people? I would expect my government to have rights for me, irrespective of where I face violence. Why wouldn't I have that for a company that is probably bigger than my government? So that's just one reason, right? Just the massiveness of a lot of these companies, how large the private sector is in general across the world and specifically in India, and also because it is the right thing to do. It's not just because your employees will be more productive, although that is a part of it. It is because your employees deserve to feel safe everywhere. Your employees deserve to know that the workplace cares about them and actually see that happen beyond you just being like a part of their production cycle. It's not an assembly line. You are more than just a part of a larger function that makes things happen. You're a person. And I think that very divide between seeing artificial entities, because that's essentially what workplaces are, as separate from their people, makes it a massive issue in them thinking about issues that happen outside of the workplace. And I just want to bring to light that we are seeing it with COVID, right? If I work from home all day and if I face domestic violence, then is my workplace responsible for my safety? Because right now, my bedroom, like I'm logging into this conversation from my bedroom. So at what point can the workplace realistically say that, okay, this is where our boundaries stop? Because this is artificial. And I think COVID just brings that more to light, that it is the responsibility of every person and of that of every entity to ensure that they do the maximum possible from their side to ensure that people feel safe, protected, and that they have a safety net and a support system to fall back on. Thanks, Tanshi.
Thanks, Vandita. Something that you said that really stood out to me was how my rights shouldn't be defined by where I've been subjected to gender-based violence by, and how the legal recourse available, the attention given to me, the remedies available to me should not necessarily be defined by the fact that this violence took place at the workplace and this violence did not take place at the workplace. and how so much of the conversation that we're having today does actually make that divide and does actually distinguish the rights I have or the remedies I have available based off of where the violence has taken place, which in hindsight is extremely arbitrary, because the impact that it has on me is not really differentiated by who or where that violence is taking place. So thanks so much, Vandita, for that. Shruti, is there something that you would like to add to this question as well?
Yeah, I also think that there is an inherent relationship between gender-based violence and workplaces. It is something that's been extensively looked at in the recent past, and it's been empirically studied for a long time as well. And if there's one thing that's certain, it is that gender-based violence can have very long-term consequences on both survivors as well as workplaces. So first coming to survivors, and this is something I'd like to emphasize more on, and then coming to workplaces, and the very significant responsibility they have, considering what a huge role they can play in the prevention of housing a very violent and unsafe environment. Um, I think all kinds of gender-based violence can have very adverse impacts on the survivor. Survivors can experience a range of negative health consequences, from symptoms of post-traumatic stress to deep psychological trauma, causing depression and anxiety and even negative physical health symptoms. And that's very important. And it's being studied very closely right now because they can have very damaging and long-lasting effects. And a lot of the times it's not just an isolated incident, right? Which means that the workplace now becomes a place of continuous, ongoing patterns of stress for the survivor. And since we're speaking about facing violence even outside of the workplace, it has been seen and studied that violence that's faced outside of the workplace, gender-based violence, can impact colleagues and co-workers at the workplace as well and impact their health negatively. And even, of course, when it is being faced at the workplace, people who witness that and are unable to prevent or act upon it when it's being experienced by their co-workers can face these negative impacts because they become part of workplaces that are structured in a way that they discourage reporting. And fear of reporting is, of course, very prevalent for both survivors and bystanders, because we've seen so many times that they're not met with the support that's needed, not just from the workplace, but also from their families or their friends or even social media, and they fear the risk of stigmatization. So then coping with violence starts translating to organizational withdrawal, where we've seen that employees who feel unsafe at work are less likely to voice out new opinions or less likely to even take active part in building and maintaining relationships. And then unsafe workplaces can start posing different kinds of barriers for knowledge transfer and consequently learning opportunities for employees. And this could also a lot of times mean that the survivor just wants to consider switching workplaces altogether. Or, of course, it could lead to a lot of absenteeism, which brings us to workplaces and how they allow for gender-based violence to thrive when there's a culture of silence. And this isn't a good thing for workplaces, even in the short term. If they don't address gender-based violence at a macro level, then they too encounter the cost of doing so, which could be anything from increased employee turnovers to gaining a poor reputation or just low productivity. And there has been a lot of research that looks at overall organizational effectiveness and the impact that gender-based violence can have on that. And if you don't have systems and measures in place that tackle and deter this sort of culture, this culture that oppresses your employees into remaining quiet or enables you to look the other way as an organization, then it can have a direct result on your organization's engagement and social capital. Naturally, because employees are not going to feel safe or engaged at work, and they may withdraw temporarily or permanently. And it also shouldn't be surprising for organizations who don't actively work towards addressing this issue that more often than not, their employees and survivors will start transferring energy away from organizational goals to protecting themselves and trying to safeguard themselves constantly. Because every single day they're just being met with this situation that's filled with non-stop potential threats. And when survivors have to spend 8 to 10 hours of their days just living through this highly exhausting cycle without having any support from the workplace, then their willingness and levels of relational trust in the organizational will be lower. And finally, just reiterating what Vandita said very perfectly, that it's important to look at why you're working towards the security of your employees. If it's solely based on a business case, that is, you want more profitability, you want a better reputation, you want to suck out all the productivity from your employees, and then you start building your initiatives and preventive measures within that framework, then the implementation of it is hardly going to impact survivors and future employees positively. So we need to start thinking of nurturing workspaces as places where people who feel marginalized don't just have to survive violence on an everyday basis. And as Vandita said, they should be able to really thrive. They should enjoy working. So yeah, I think there's a very simple and easy reason for that. That is that safety should be a right at any workplace.
Thank you for that, Shruti. I think all of that was extremely pertinent. And something that I want to build up from that is how workplaces, when they don't play a role in this, can lead to long-term structural violence. I'm not exactly sure of the numbers, but I think a year ago or something, there was a report where there were multiple $trillion of losses because of intimate partner violence every year. I think about 3% of the GDP of some country or something, which talks about when I face intimate partner violence at home, which could include domestic violence, I am going to be missing X number of work days at work. And my productivity is going to fall by X numbers. While I don't necessarily care about what it says in terms of productivity, what I do care about is what it could do to the career of that person when workplaces don't understand and make space for gender-based violence that exists outside of the workplace. Sorry, my internet dropped off. Yes. So as I was saying, what can end up happening is that over the long term, specific gender and sexual minorities that are more prone to facing violence at the workplace, outside of the workplace, face additional financial violence because this gender-based violence is not being recognized, or there's no space being created for it within the workspace to address this or to create any sort of support for it. And in the long term, it reduces their professional growth, it reduces their financial access, and it just leads to more and more cycles of abuse and harm because they're becoming more dependent on possibly the perpetrator or possibly on systems that are not as supportive of them, are not going to help them leave a situation of gender-based violence. And I feel that's also a major reason for why workplaces should be involved, because not having this cognizance, not having these conversations at the workplace, just not having policy around gender-based violence outside of the workplace, within the workplace, can create an issue. Thanks, Sutanshi.
Thanks, Shruti and Vandita, for that valuable insight into why we need to start having this conversation, why we need to start talking about workplace responsibility and the responsibilities that we have towards survivors of gender-based violence. And you all made very valid points, right? You all spoke about how it's not just for the well-being of the survivors who are also our employees, but also how it makes for a strong business case. Although that is not the strongest argument that we should be making to push for workplaces to care about these conversations. As we have seen, these conversations often these arguments are what pushes workplaces towards having these conversations, right? These conversations where we're going to be able to go to them and tell them, look, statistically, you're going to be doing much better if you do this. That really helps encourage workplaces to start thinking about how they can help survivors facing gender-based violence as well. Which takes me to the next question that I have for Ashita here. Ashita, you're a lawyer, and could you tell us a few legal responsibilities that workplaces have towards survivors of gender-based violence? And what does this legal framework look like in India? And does that cover the conversation that we're sort of having today?
Yeah, sorry. So there is a legal framework that deals with gender-based violence at the workplace to an extent. We of course had the Prevention of Sexual Harassment at the Workplace Act, which deals with sexual harassment at the workplace. So that's one type of gender-based violence that it accounts for. There's also the Equal Remuneration Act, which very directly links to financial violence that can take place at the workplace, which is also a form of GBV, where if you're for the same work or the same position, you're being paid, say, a lesser amount because of your gender, then that falls within financial violence. There's also the Transgender Persons Act, which puts into place, which makes a provision for a complaint officer to take into account grievances for violations under the Act to be put in place at the workplace. And then there are sort of other beneficial legislations under the labor laws, the Maternity Benefits Act, and all of that takes into account different types of GBV to an extent that might happen at the workplace.
So, thank you for that overview of the existing legal framework. And do you think that, with your experience in the organization, your experience working with different clients, do you feel like this legal framework is adequate to offer realistic, meaningful support to survivors of gender based violence? Because my understanding has been that these laws cover a lot of violence which takes place within workplaces. Which I'm sure have their own challenges. But do you also feel like this legal framework is adequate in terms of enforcing obligations on workplaces to support survivors who may face violence outside of the workplace?
Okay, so first I'll deal with how in within dealing with it in the workplace, the law can still be inadequate. Couple of things that the law says: the POSH Act only allows for women to file a complaint under the Act. The POSH Act also only accounts for sexual harassment that takes place, which is one type of GBV. There are many other forms of gender-based violence that can take place. Like the Transgender Persons Act, I said, it puts in place a complaint officer, but it does nothing more than that. It doesn't tell us any specific obligations, any procedure that the officer has to follow. And in that, it just does like lip service. It's just a tokenistic provision that's been put into place. And while those are some things that are that exist within the law, there are issues with implementation. With the POSH Act, especially, we've found a lot of times either ICCs are not constituted, or workplaces have the internal complaints committee constituted only on paper, and it's only for the sake of compliance, and they're not effective or don't function properly. But going beyond this, there are lots of things that the law does not account for. For example, intersectional violence. So to think of what happens when caste-based violence and gender-based violence overlap. The survivor might be covered under the Act, but the Act will not account for those identities. And this, in fact, flows into how the internal complaint committee members are trained. So the law says that they have to be trained for the law. And often, like we've seen, that the training ends at a basic 101 of the law, what section says what. Whereas I think to truly address gender-based violence, any form of gender-based violence, it's important for us to then think about training these members in trauma-sensitive approaches, intersectionality. So it's okay for the law to not explicitly say that, but then our trainings and our best practices for our ICC members need to go beyond what the law just provides for. And yeah, now coming to the second part of your question, that does our legal framework account for gender-based violence that our employees might face outside the workplace? So the legal framework ends at types of types of gender-based violence that might take place within the workplace. It doesn't account for the fact that our employees might be facing gender-based violence outside our workplace. And like Vandita mentioned, right, there's so many types of violence that our employees can be facing outside, but somehow there is this strict distinction between the lives that our employees will lead inside and outside the office, and the employer's obligation just ends at sexual harassment that might be taking place inside the workplace. And I think there is some merit in going beyond this and to start having conversations about how workplace structures can start addressing uh, while gender-based violence that our employees might face outside, because it's something that's bound to impact them, bound to impact their work inside the office. And then sort of this expectation that we have from our employees to show up a certain way regardless of what's going on in their personal lives is unreasonable. And workplaces right now don't just not address gender-based violence that employees might face outside, but they add like an additional burden where they expect that you will walk in like nothing has happened and you're this machine or like a smartphone that can switch off that part of your life and close those apps and just walk into the office door. So I think going beyond that, I think there's merit in at least having these conversations where we look at workplaces as powerful tools to address gender-based violence that our employees might be facing outside of work.
Thank you, Ashita. I think your answer gave us a lot of insight into what's missing in the existing legal framework, but also took us a step further to start thinking about why don't we have these obligations? And then I'm also thinking about, even if we were to have a law, given what you said about how we don't have data on the ICC, given how you said we don't have trainings. Now I'm thinking, would actually having those laws even address the problem, right? Would it be okay for us to draft a law which says, yeah, tomorrow workplaces also have to talk about domestic violence with their employees. We need to have a redressal system for survivors who face domestic violence. Clearly, with the POSH law or the Prevention of Sexual Harassment law, that's also not a problem that's being solved. Which then takes me to the question for Vandita, given your experience with a lot of our clients, with a lot of other organizations who work with different areas, right? What do you think is missing, or what do you think makes it difficult for workplaces to start having these conversations? Why, firstly, do you think that workplaces shy away from offering support to survivors of gender based violence when violence takes place outside of the workplace? And secondly, do you see that, through your experience, have you seen any realistic challenges that workplaces may end up facing when we tell them, look, this is why you need to go ahead and support them? Do you think that there's going to be pushback, and why do you think there's going to be this pushback?
Thank you, Tanshi. I'm actually going to build off what other people have been saying and give you like two scenarios. One is a best intent case scenario, right? Where we believe that the companies really want to do this and perhaps don't have pathways to do this. And the second one, perhaps the more realistic one, is saying that they have pathways and they perhaps just don't want to do it. And the reason I say this is also because the way our laws are made, something that Ashita spoke about is the POSH Act, which talks about prevention and redressal of sexual harassment at workplaces. That doesn't have any employer responsibilities. Like, if you really look at it, the employer's responsibility is more logistical. It's more about bringing people together and ensuring that the redressal process happens. I've asked this question a lot, like, for example, monetary compensation or the sort of support I could get depends a lot on who my perpetrator is. But what happens in the case when the perpetrator comes from a space of low income? In that case, I would not get as much support because it's very dependent on the income of the perpetrator. Where is the employer responsible? In another case, if I got a medical injury while I was working, my company would be responsible. There would be vicarious liability. So when we think about gender-based violence and sexual violence at the workplace, there isn't enough that the employer has to do beyond setting up logistics and beyond setting up some basic administrative functions. And I feel like that is a conversation that in and of itself is missing so much. So I say that when we don't even have that, even when we think about laws and policies as solutions, I'm concerned about what these laws and policies would do beyond saying, oh, let's have a conversation at the workplace. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but there needs to be more. However, some of the reasons that I think that workplaces don't take these steps is a lot of companies we've worked with, they just don't know this is something they can or should be doing. And this is my best intent scenario, right? Where they just don't know. They've not thought about, oh, we could also talk about addressing domestic violence internally. So I feel like those are some things that need to be tackled too. Like just having conversations, having open access information that allows them to think beyond the legal frameworks of what they're supposed to do. Because companies are often just stuck in doing compliance work. Ashita also brought up that we don't really think about addressing sexual violence beyond conversations that the law requires. We don't talk about intersectionality with the internal committees, for example, because the law doesn't require it. So workplaces will often not seek information or seek to do compliance measures that are not really compliance, and that might just be something that their employees need or want. So while that is one part, like there is no legal standing and there's just a lack of information in some cases, there's also for a very long period of time a certain work-life boundary that's been created. And that allows, as I was talking about earlier, for structural violence to continue until we continue to have like conversations or solutions which are in silos, right? Or like, this is for the workplace, this is for your house. We don't challenge structural violence. We challenge individual cases, perhaps. So if my employer is a good employer, I will probably get some support. But this shouldn't be a value judgment anyway. I should be getting this support as a matter of right. And when we have these silos in spaces, we allow power to accumulate and function in the way it does in our communities. And this allows for a culture where gender based violence goes on. And sometimes I feel that maybe companies don't want to tackle that because we forget that companies are also made up of the very people that exist outside of these workplaces. And if there is like, I mean, there's 94 to 95% of sexual violence that happens by someone we know. So these are people like us. I mean, even the idea that sexual or gender-based violence happens in low-income groups, these are false ideas. It happens across categories, which is why companies having a stakeholdership here is so important. And perhaps also the reason companies don't, because they realize just how high this incidence is. And not doing it allows them to get away. But if they started saying, oh, we'll be responsible, they would have a lot of responsibility to take on. Apart from this, of course, there are several cultural factors. One, like I mentioned, if you look at it from a good intent point of view, it's just capacity and boundaries of support possible. I'm sure some of you all will talk about what we're doing at One Future Collective, but we're a small not-for-profit. And we do have capacity boundaries, right, in terms of finances, in terms of the sort of support we could provide, even in just in terms of human resources. Like, what happens if I give someone a leave for 3 months? Can I really afford that? Like, can I afford to have one of my staff paid outside of the space and not be working for 3 months? So all of these things, I think, really play out over here. And the final thing, at least for me, and I see this as being a very important thing that we don't necessarily always talk about, is the shame and the cultural aspects of gender-based violence. Like, we don't talk about pain, we don't talk about trauma, we don't even talk about hurt. It's so difficult at the workplace to even have a conversation and say, you know, what you said yesterday hurt me. We never say that. We can express it in anger, but do we really express it in the language that we're experiencing it in? So just this culture of silence, not having a vocabulary around what we're genuinely feeling, not knowing how to talk, like not knowing how to talk about these things, and the general shame associated with it. When the HR comes out with a policy saying we will address gender-based violence outside of the workplace, it's also recognition of the fact that there are employees in this fancy MNC that are facing gender-based violence. And that's a difficult thing for people to like get at peace with, to think that this is happening around me. It's not happening to my domestic worker. It's not happening to this cousin of mine, to a friend of mine. It's happening to me, or it's happening to people like me who I thought were immune from it. So I feel like these are a lot of the structural, cultural barriers that keep people away. But I'm sure there are many more reasons to it as well.
Anita, I'd just like to build on what you said right now about not having the vocabulary to deal with these issues. Um, it struck a chord when you said that people from fancy offices don't think that such things can happen around them. And I think the reason for this is because we think of, um, well-established workplaces as being progressive just by the infrastructure that they have around them. And that progressiveness does not translate into their internal workplace policies. So that's where sort of the dissonance arises, and that's probably a part of the reason why we can't talk about it so openly, because it's seen as a very professional atmosphere. You don't talk much about home. You think that, as Ashita and Manta both brought up, you're treating your employees just as, a cog in the machine and not as people who have lives outside the workplace. So I do think that that builds up into the reason why workplaces aren't able to address these issues as effectively as we'd like them to. Thank you, Vanita and Vatanshi.
Something that some of you all mentioned here, and tying to the point about us being a cog in the machine, is the phrase work-life balance, and how we've grown up listening to it, right? Like we've grown up saying work-life balance. We've grown up saying work-life. I don't know, like clothes and everything, right? Like we treat these things as two different things. But then, as you were speaking, I'm thinking of the words work and life, and how we're just seeing them as mutually exclusive terms, and we're like, okay, when I'm at work I don't have a life, which is clearly not true, because I continue to live, and I'm not, my life doesn't come to an end because I'm working somewhere. And that whole phrase, and while you were speaking, I just thought of that, how we as a culture, we all think it's so okay for us to completely distinguish between what we do at work and what we do in life, and
I'm just
we're
going to
just
add
trained to think, yes,
Yes.
Sanada. Yeah.
this phrase that a lot of people say, that bring your full self to work.
Yeah.
But if you want this divide, you really can't, because they don't really want you to bring your full self. They want you to bring the self they prefer, like with all the edits in place. Yeah.
Yeah, and your most productive, your sharpest, your most intelligent, your strongest negotiator self to work, which sort of works to everybody's benefit, right? And then there's the whole question of, look, but my whole self is messy, my whole self is feeling pain, and my whole self is feeling hurt. But here you are expecting me to show up at this meeting and have these really professional, which is also a word I've been thinking about a lot in terms of professional attire or professional, having a professional relationship with someone. And it just makes it so much harder, I think, for us as colleagues also to just share with each other and build that relationship, given how many hours we spend at work in a week, right? If I'm spending 60 hours of my time at work, and if you're telling me I need to be only professional with everybody I'm around, then when am I going to build social relationships? When am I going to start having a conversation where I'm able to discuss my personal life? And yeah, I mean, just some things to think of, I think, and which sort of takes me to the next bit of the conversation I want to have with all of you about, now we're able to see why these challenges exist. We're able to see why workplaces are sort of hesitant to come forward and support survivors. Sanaya, do you have any actionable points that you think we can recommend to our listeners, just to sort of go back to their workplace and say, you know what, these are some ways by which we can actually make this happen? It seems tough, but it doesn't have to be as tough as it's seeming.
Thanks, Utanshi. Yes, I think I'll work outside in for this. So we'll start with workplace culture and having a zero tolerance policy for harassment and, um, you know, misbehavior at the workplace. I think it starts from there, and it starts from an employer taking strict action against people who have a chalta hai attitude at work, meaning that if I make an inappropriate comment towards a coworker and that coworker feels bad about it, going back to the point about microaggressions, like Shruti said earlier, these are small things that can lead up to violence against people, which isn't addressed properly at the workplace because there aren't policies in place to address it in the first place. So, workplaces need to start understanding what their responsibilities are and start building clear policies on anti sexual harassment, anti harassment, anti domestic violence, and also training their employees to talk about these issues more openly and encouraging them to speak out. And they can really do this only when they set an example for their employees. So if an employee does choose to approach you about their issues or their grievances, you then take strict action against it, or inform them about their rights and the options available to them instead of dismissing it or treating it as a non-issue. The next thing that an employer could do is also, and what is also important, is also not forcing a survivor to report an incident. And this is important because we have to understand that it is truly difficult for a survivor of domestic violence to speak out against what has happened to them. It's difficult to even recount the incident sometimes. So, when we are encouraging our employees to speak out, we should also encourage them to explore alternate options if that's better for them. And now I'd like to move on to a subject where we can talk about how employers can support their survivors. And I'd like to mention that I'm getting a lot of this information from an app called Sahas, which is built by Kirti Jayakumar from the who also is the founder of the Gender Security Project. So when we talk about supporting survivors at the workplace, there are a few ways to do this. One of them is to build empathy. So building a safe space where there is no judgment, no bias, to be really accessible to your employees and actively listen to what they have to say. Another is trust. So an important thing that we at OFC talk about is to believe survivors. And when we say believe survivors, I don't say that you have to take what they talk about at face value, but acknowledge that they have certain lived experience and listen to them during the course of an investigation or whatever action you propose to take or however you want to help them out. Also, trust would mean acknowledging that speaking up is difficult, establishing that non judgmental space, and ensuring adequate protection from retaliation at the workplace, especially. So, I know as an employee that if I'm about to speak out against a coworker, that I'm not going to face backlash from my workplace, from coworkers that maybe support that person, because my employer has these strict measures in place and I know that I'm safe. Another thing that employers can do is to establish a no blame policy, which means that you listen from a space of no judgment. You inform them of their options that they have available at the workplace. And this could look very different for the kind of capacity that your organization has. So you could offer mental health support, you could offer pro bono legal aid to them depending on your capacity. You can even afford financial support to someone who's facing domestic violence. And these are just a few measures that you can take as an employer to change the culture and the conversation around domestic violence. Um, I'd also like to talk about more long term practices. And this could look like diversifying your leadership. And this ties into the point that Ashita and Vandita raised earlier about how the law provides for training of people on what the law says and regulations on how you're supposed to deal with a complaint, for example, but it doesn't address the underlying issues that affect your reaction to these complaints in the first place. So diversify your leadership, hire people of different identities at different intersections, and make sure that this is across board, top down. And also things like enforcing paid leave or giving micro loans to your employees when they need to. And here I can come to a few best practices that One Future Collective has instituted. So since COVID and for a while, we've instituted paid leave, mental health days for our employees, and we're in the process of finalizing situation where we can support our employees even financially. Apart from this, One Future Collective also conducts training programs with our clients. So when we say that we conduct anti-sexual harassment training, we also include diversity, equity, and inclusivity training, and we also include gender sensitization within it. So you're not just addressing what the law says, but you're addressing the root cause of the problem. I'd like to here also mention a great initiative by some of the fellows of the One Future Fellowship in 2020. It's called Char Diwar Ke Paar. And what this initiative does is to turn workplaces into safe spaces by addressing domestic abuse as a workplace issue and helping organizations respond to it. So what they want to do is to get you as an employer on board and help you to take concrete measures so that your workplace is safer for your employees and enables your employees to feel like they can come to you for issues such as domestic violence that they face. A couple of other examples are of Vodafone, actually, where they have rolled out a 10-day safe leave for all their employees across 26 markets to anyone experiencing domestic violence or abuse. They also have an app called Bright Sky, which connects survivors to services, and they have a specific HR policy on domestic violence for their staff. There's also another international luxury fashion brand called the Kering Group, which had an internal training curriculum for its employees to support a safe working environment. And they rolled this out in Italy, UK, China, USA. And because of the great response that the company got, it now has a level 2 full day course to train their employees to be internal advocates and teaches them how to support survivors better within the company. So these are just a few best practices. I think we can get more into detail about it at another point, and that would be a whole separate conversation. But Vanita, is there anything you'd like to add to these?
Thank you, Sanaya. I think these were excellent suggestions. I do know that we've been focusing a little on domestic violence, but I would just like to also call attention to other forms of violence that you could face outside of the workplace. It could be small things. I mean, I don't want to quantify, but it could be things like facing sexual violence outside of the workplace. It could mean that as a young professional, I don't have financial autonomy over my income. It could mean that I'm being forced into marriage as a 25-year-old. Because these are not issues that only happen at a certain strata of society, right? They can and they do happen with persons at varying intersections of identity. So, what is my responsibility as someone who leads an organization when one of my employees is probably being forced into a marriage that they do not want to partake in? Do I have a responsibility there? What is it that I can do? While domestic violence, because of its existing conversations and existing interventions that some organizations take across the world, has some roadmap. Conversations around these issues are often quite lacking. We don't really know what to do if an employee is being forced into a marriage. We don't really know what to do if someone's facing sexual violence. Like, some companies would be okay giving a 10 days paid leave, but these are also solutions that are not adequate. And I know that it's a great starting point, but if I, for example, decide to pursue a legal case against my perpetrator, that is probably going to take me a couple of years. And I'm going to need my workplace to support me through those years. And not just in terms of paid leave, I'm going to need days when I might randomly have to go to court. I'm going to need days when I might need leave for other things. What if I'm being stalked? I might need my workplace to step up and provide me with protection for coming to and fro from the office. And protection in a way that doesn't isolate me at the workplace, but allows me to be a part of the workplace, but still ensure that I'm safe. So I just want us to also question the boundaries of where all can a workplace interject. The more you think about it, you will realize that there are so many intersection points, because when you're facing gender-based violence of any form, you are that same person who comes into the workplace, and they're the same people who interact with you. You have relationships with them, professional or otherwise, and that there are multiple like interventions that a workplace can make to ensure that you get legal, financial, housing support, but also to just ensure that you can leave an abusive situation, so that you can feel safer, so that you just have some sort of interim protection. And these are things workplaces can start doing now. Like, these aren't things that workplaces need to wait for a law or policy to come in place for. Thanks, Naya.
I think those are some great actionable points that workplaces can start involving in their immediate policies and how they interact with their employees. And something that I want to point out too was also something that Sanaya mentioned actually about the values of empathy, trust, and what they look like in practice, right? Because we've been talking about how a lot of the times we can't have these conversations because we don't know how. We don't know what to say to someone if they come to us and they tell us that, look, this is happening to me. We've been brought up trying to avoid shame. We've been brought up trying to avoid pain. We've been brought up trying to say, and we've rewarded it. Like, institutionally, historically, we've rewarded people who show up at work like nothing's happening. We want people to be available 24/7. We want people to say, yes, I'll do it no matter what time it is, no matter what day of the week it is. And we've rewarded that behavior, right? Which, on the flip side, then I start thinking of systems where there is consumerism, which is run by institutions and historical rewarding of systems which allow me to constantly place my worth based off of how much money I make or how much respect I get at work. And how, in that attempt to be better in a certain unilateral understanding of the word, I also end up in some way ignoring so much of my personal requirements, so much of my personal psychological needs, that at some point I've just started convincing myself that, yeah, of course the workplace doesn't owe me this support, or of course the workplace shouldn't be a place where I can go up to someone and say, look, I won't be able to come into work today because of XYZ reasons. And really thinking about how these practices can translate into real time conversations, right? Like, it's easy for us to say things like be empathetic, but what really stood out to me about what Sanaya was saying was how we can be empathetic, how we can really trust people, and how, although these are really fantastic values we've all grown up, cherishing and practicing, and everybody's told us, oh, if you're empathetic, you're a nice person. Nobody's really telling us what empathy looks like in practice. And I feel like somehow the conversation we're having today will at least start having that conversation about how empathy is not something that's indescribable. It's not an emotion that's something that you and I can't really talk about in practice. Which takes me actually to the next part, right? We've been for so long talking about what stakeholders such as workplaces have to do in terms of supporting survivors. How can workplaces support survivors? Say, for example, we do have these support systems in place. My best bet is survivors may still not be able to come up and share their stories with their colleagues, may not be able to come forward and tell their employers that, look, this is happening. Which then gets me to ask y'all, do you think there are any challenges that survivors may face when they want to have this conversation? Do you feel like survivors may feel a certain sense of inhibition when they want to come forward and share their stories with their workplace? Ashita, would you like to go first? Yeah.
I think Sanaya mentioned that survivors will anyway find it very difficult to come up and speak, but the system doesn't make it any easier for them. There are multiple things that will constantly be a roadblock in a survivor being able to come forward. Something that we saw come up specifically during the pandemic when everything just moved online was to know things like how to approach even like the internal complaints committee of our organization, or then to evaluate is this even sexual harassment, because we were doing so much of our work online and the personal professional boundaries that we've always tried to put in place were even more blurred. And then there have always been certain challenges, right? So the issue with how this will be received, so the receptivity of a survivor speaking up, often a survivor will feel like they'll be looked down upon for speaking up even within the workplace. You'll become that employee in the workplace that everyone will talk about, or that if you speak up, you will become, say, an inconvenience, or your boss will favor your colleagues over you in small ways, like they'll give them more work, stuff like that. And then I think Vanta brought up the point of shame around having these conversations in the workplace. And that shame then automatically translates into stigma for the survivor when the survivor chooses to speak up. Uh, and this is something that we face within society generally also, but it does translate into the workplace. And then I think the major challenge is, I think, the culture that we've developed, right? So let's think about the fact that workplaces have mental health and period leaves in place, right? But an employee will choose not to take it because of how it's viewed. You'll be seen, there's a fear of being seen as lazy, fear of being seen as avoiding work, and this sort of hustle culture that we've come to idealize, that's also going to be a roadblock for a survivor speaking up. Utanshi mentioned, my worth as an employee is not measured only by how good I am at my work, but just how much of my personal life or my mental health I'm willing to sacrifice for this work. So it doesn't matter like if I can finish my work in 5 days and take the weekend off, but I'll be a better employee if I'm still willing to give up that weekend. So this culture then leads to a situation where a complaint by me is then seen as a hindrance in productivity of the organization. And if my complaint then as a survivor is a hindrance in the productivity, then I become a hindrance. Then I'm not bringing that best productive self to work, and I'm just a hindrance in their productivity. And then as an employee, that's just going to be a huge issue for me to speak up and come forward. Shruti, would you like to add something?
Yeah. Um, Thank you for sharing that, Ashita. I'm just going to actually build on what you're saying and probably actually speak about something a bit specific right now. Because I think it's really important to have this conversation right now and focus on what sort of challenges can sprout up during a pandemic, and whether as an organization are you up to tackle them and really support your employees. Um, so during the lockdown, that is ever since COVID, rates of violence faced is a lot higher by those people who are also facing social marginalization. And this leads to them being highly vulnerable and exposed to further harassment and discrimination. And one of the challenges that just come to my mind right now is the one that's being faced by queer people during the pandemic. Um, a lot of queer people are facing increased family violence and intimate partner violence due to the lockdown, actually, and they're often unable to reach out for support from their employers. It could be to possibly leave their house or just relocate somewhere else temporarily. And this sort of brings us to think about who are our employers. Are there queer people on the board, or are there people who are queer in senior management, or even who we report to, who will be able to relate and empathize with our experiences that we're currently facing, so they can push for us to receive relief and support from the organization. And it's also going to make you think about what are your organization's policies, whether they have systems in place where they can think about COVID relief in all perspectives and account for the fact that there are different kinds of people from diverse backgrounds in the organization who might be facing violence right now in different forms, and other unique challenges that just that did not exist before. And lastly, just one thing that comes to my mind is, now that I'm speaking about a situation like this, the sort of dilemmas that a person in this position might be facing, especially when they're queer. So if you need to approach your organization or seek this sort of support, then there's a possibility that you may have to come out, and you haven't been prepared for this because you weren't out at your organization all along. And then there's that added stress involved, especially if you can't predict the reaction as to whether they will be supportive, whether they had these policies, whether they are going to be accepting or not. And the latter happens a lot of times, which can lead to further negative impacts, psychologically, and possibly even more financial crunches. So yeah, I think as an organization, it's a great time to introspect and really change things around you and commit to creating a safe workplace, and do it in a way that you're allowing for that space, that when an employee wants to reach out to you, when they're considering it, they they do have some sort of assurance that yes, I will receive some sort of support. So yeah.
Thanks for that, Shruti and Ashita. I think those points were extremely valid and really describe some of the challenges that survivors may be facing when when they're making the decision whether this is a conversation I even want to have with my employers, and how, as employers and as workplaces, we can make that easy for survivors, however, in whichever way we can. But we've been speaking for over 40 minutes now, and something that's really standing out to me is how these conversations can't happen overnight, and how no matter what policies I have on paper, it will be very tough to really start talking about these things and cause the change that we want to through these conversations. I'm also learning that we need to build a culture that seeks to dismantle rape culture and the false boundaries that allow workplaces to not support their people beyond the office space. Sanaya, Vandita, any concluding thoughts on how we can really start building and investing in these relationships between employers, employees, and the general workplace atmosphere as well? Sanaya, why don't you start?
Thanks, Atanshi. Yes, I think what we've really carried forward from our conversation from the beginning is to treat your employees as your people and really prioritize them as people and not just as people who are, you know, producing work for you. And what this means is then you have to be open to having conversations that are not workplace conversations. There are conversations that will teach us how to build social relationships and how to strengthen them, and also how to be that safe space for people even at the workplace, because we know that it's so difficult to compartmentalize your life outside versus your life at the workplace. So then it's really the responsibility of the employer to foster a place where people can feel okay to talk about someone else at work, saying, okay, hey, this happened to me at home or outside and I need help. And that really comes from, leadership showing the way, encouraging people to have these conversations, maybe even just do it like have a survey in your organization to see how people would respond to an anti-sexual harassment policy, a domestic violence policy, see whether people are willing to speak out, see whether they're willing to have conversations about gender, sex identities with each other at the workplace. I think that goes a long way in fostering a culture where talking about this is okay, and then also fostering a culture of respect. So when I say respect, I also talk about empathy, like we did talk about earlier, about you respecting your coworker or your boss or your employee as a person first, and also acknowledge that they have lives beyond the workplace. And finally, I think just strong workplace policies with openness and transparency and the ability to act, I think is super important for employers, where you can show your employee that when they seek help, they will be like responded to, and they will not be dismissed or ignored, or their troubles will not be considered inconsequential. So those are my thoughts. Vanita?
Thank you for that, Sanaya. I think all of those are extremely pertinent. And these aren't things that you need to push off to like 10 years down the line. It's something that you can start doing now. I will also go as far as to say that they're not high cost, high investment things. But I do feel like the place to start for everyone listening in, you are an employee somewhere, you're a student somewhere, you're just a person existing under some societal structure. Start questioning this, like the very fact that you're taught that, oh, this is the boundary of what the workplace would do, is something that is not set in stone. It's something that we as a society decided. I mean, workplaces ask people to take back work to their homes all the time. Why can't we expect, why can't we just have that expectation that I can take my life to my workplace as well? So these are just constructs that you're taught over time and they're just ingrained into you. So just start with questioning that. You can start with questioning that as an employee, and to leaders of organizations, you can start questioning that as the leadership of an organization. There is absolutely nothing that prevents you from being the first person to be doing something and to also test and fail at it. Perhaps you'll give people a 10-day leave if they're facing domestic violence, and it's pointless. It doesn't help them. But it's still a way to start. It's still a way to see what works and what doesn't work. And that's important. It's important that you start putting in something towards what you say your beliefs are, your values are. So I think that is one thing that's extremely important for me. Second, in the absence of laws and policies that make support for gender based violence outside of the workplace a legal compliance issue, I would recommend that you have formal systems in place which set in place a process, a procedure, certain liabilities and obligations of the organization towards its people, in terms of all of these things that we've been talking about. Because you'll often notice that people shift, people leave organizations, but the system has to stay. And the system stays only when it is documented. It only stays when I have an actionable right that does not depend on the whims and fancies of one CEO who decided at some point that this is how things have to be, right? So I think a lot of that, like identifying, naming, calling out these issues, um, questioning structures that exist, and building formal spaces where you can actually take these conversations into your workplace. And as employees, you really need to mobilize, you need to organize. Your solidarity towards a company, which is essentially an artificial entity made on paper and only represents real living people, cannot be more than that of your solidarity towards other people, like actual people. And to start with that and to start mobilizing and organizing and saying, these are the rights we want, like that's where you should be starting at. That's all from me, Utanshi. Thank you.
Thanks, Vanita and Sanaya. I think those were really important points to discuss what these policies can look like at the workplace. And, even for people who've had this conversation before us, where I hope that through our conversation, we've tried to give more actionable points. We've tried to add more value to the conversation that's been happening for so long and really bring the conversation about gender-based violence to work, even in instances where the gender-based violence actually takes place outside of work. So thank you so much for taking the time out and for having this conversation. It's been an immense learning experience for me, as I hope that it has for you all as well. And just a few concluding thoughts from my end before we log off is I'm really hoping for this conversation to be at least a point for us to think um, differently from what we probably have been for so long. We've been internalizing the fact that our work is different from our lives. And I hope that at least a part of that thought process is being challenged listening to this conversation. And also to not just look at that conversation or that binary as something that the workplace owes for you to break, but also for something that you can rightfully ask to be broken, something that you know is an entitlement, something that you know is something you can go to your employer and say, look, you can't expect this from me. And on the flip side, for the employer to build a culture where employees who come forward and say this are not penalized, employees who come forward and say this um, are welcomed with support and not with consequences. So that's it from my end. If there are no other concluding thoughts from anybody else on this conversation, I think we're good to end. Yes,
Nothing
Vandita.
from me. Thank you just for holding space so beautifully. To people listening in, I would say that you can continue to ask us questions or share what you're thinking just by way of comments or otherwise. We would love to take these conversations further. And knowing what you're thinking or what you're expecting will help us set the process for it. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Vandita. Bye bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.